Hello, David.
We're great today. Yeah, it's a beautiful day and delighted to be here.
I'm glad you're with us. We're going to be talking today about agility and how it's so much more than just a buzzword. And just to give one example of why this is relevant, yesterday, President Trump said he was going to disband the coronavirus task force that was led by Mike Pence and included Dr. Fauci by the end of May because the crisis was over and it was time to get back to work. Then this morning, President Trump says, no, I'm not going to disband the task force after all. So you've got this stuff coming in from every direction. Who ever would have expected it? I mean, we're really living in a world of, you call black swans, if you want to use a bit of a cliche these days. How do we deal with this? We've got constant, massive disruption coming to us in every direction at every moment. We're used to a system generally of linear management, the kind of thing that got Henry Ford to make automobiles and brought us the Industrial Revolution, the prosperity we have. But it seems like the real thing we need to be doing is moving on from that and looking at what we call agility. So my question to you, David, the first one is, what exactly is agility and why is it really the only response in this situation?
Well, thank you, Peter. You mentioned a black swan. So we are living in a world that has been subjected to an incredible disruption. And the COVID-19 crisis has transformed in a matter of weeks so many aspects of our world and our daily lives that it's difficult to really take it all in. We can ask a question: did COVID-19 change the world, or did it just reveal the world that was already there that we didn't see? And not to get too philosophical, but if we take the lens of complexity theory, we take the lens of understanding that the world is a highly complex system filled with a multitude of interdependent and independent parts that operate simultaneously, we come away with the notion that the world of complexity and the world of disruption was there, and COVID-19 just laid it bare for us. This world was already in existence, and now it's simply not a deniable fact that we live in it. Previously, and for a long period of time, the Henry Ford production model, the linear system model, worked really well. It has been a great toolkit for producing value. And in many ways, in many small compartmental areas, it will continue to be so. It turns out, though, that it's not a very good toolkit to handle massive disruption. And it's not a good toolkit to handle massive disruption because it doesn't prepare individuals for change.
So how do you prepare individuals for change then? How do you make that jump?
Well, we're coming to this problem, through the concept of agility. Agility or agile is an idea that is probably familiar to most, if not all, of the folks tuning into PentaLive. We know that it comes from the software industry. We know that it's spread into the management consulting world and other sectors of enlightened management. But what does it really mean, and where did it come from? We ask this question because we want to really think about not just the methodological rules, but actually the purpose of agility. And it turns out that software engineers had an early glimpse of what I'll call the undeniability of complexity. Software projects are complex systems. If you've ever been on a software project, it feels a bit like a hurricane. It feels like you're lost in a new city that you've never been to. It's a complex system. The requirements are in a sense unknown, even if they're highly detailed. The reality is that they're not really known fully. Client expectations aren't fully known. Stakeholder expectations aren't fully known. And so how do we proceed? How do we make progress and deliver value while acknowledging these massive unknowns? The birth of Agile came from the realization that the command and control linear Henry Ford model was broken. Instead of delivering software projects on time and on budget and meeting all the stakeholder expectations, it did exactly the opposite. And so a new idea came to be, and that idea was Agile.
So we're talking about Agile. What does it represent? We understand, a lot of us understand this in software terms.
Yeah.
Don't think that you can lay out a roadmap at the beginning that's going to get you where you need to be 6 or 12 months down the road. There are all kinds of things are going to come up that we couldn't have thought of, and we have to adjust and move and be somewhat autonomous. But it's very hard in a larger organization. Are we talking about sticking with the same people? Are we talking about changing mindsets? How do you implement this outside of the tech suite or the tech sector in a company?
Well, let's talk about the mindset. I think that's a good word, and it's a good way to think about what agility can bring to us all. And I think I would say for any person who has been experiencing the COVID crisis, it isn't just the workplace which has been disrupted. Our access to basic services has been disrupted. For those of us with children, the school experience has been massively disrupted. Going to the grocery store to get basic supplies has been massively disrupted. So there really isn't at the moment, a lot of predictability and a lot of clear rules that we can rely on for how we're supposed to engage in our lives and in our work. So the command and control toolkit is really bad at helping people, allowing people to move forward in the absence of instructions. It just doesn't work. If the command and control system is broken and there's no instructions, or if the instructions can't be delivered in time to accommodate change, which is often the case, life and work stops. What agility brings to bear is the notion of self-organization. At the core of agility, at its essence, is the idea that an individual and a team, and an individual within a team, and a team by itself and in relationship to other teams, has the potential to self-organize. And when a team self-organizes, it doesn't rely entirely on the conditions around it. It has an innate resilience. It can understand by itself and define the work that it's supposed to do, the way that it's going to do its work, and most importantly, the reason why it's going to do its work. It can do all of those things. It can decide what to do, how to do it, and why to do it in a scenario where information is limited, where information is always going to be limited. And it does that by giving teams the ability to interact with each other at both a work and human level that recognizes the reality of work.
So, when you say the reality of work, talk to me a little more about that. I find that fascinating. Is something we've been ignoring?
I wouldn't say we've been ignoring it, but again, I don't think all sectors have experienced this phenomena, and it's for sure the case that the software industry and the engineering industry were the first sector to experience this. But when individuals and teams are expected to advance despite unknowns, in the face of unknowns, in the face of change, in the face of doubt, and even in the face of mistakes, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, for that team and that individual to be in a predictive, linear command and control mindset, because there will be too much time taken up simply gaining instructions, simply describing problems. When we empower individuals to define the work, to estimate the work, to interact with each other as equals in doing the work, it turns out we unleash a huge amount of creativity, a huge amount of engagement, and a huge amount of satisfaction with the work. And that output, that human output of making the work more meaningful and therefore better, is something that is very difficult to achieve in any other way.
But in the classic organization, and as a journalist, I've worked in a lot of newsrooms, which tend to be extraordinarily hierarchical, almost dictatorial. The editor-in-chief says, this is what will be in today's paper. You have to create incentives for people to perform in a certain way. And those incentives in traditional hierarchies are often, very clear. You meet these KPIs, you get this salary, this bonus, you don't get fired, you get this promotion, this trip if you're an ad salesperson, that kind of thing. And you also use those incentives to build loyalty to the organization, not to yourself. How do you prevent, in a situation like you're describing, which is much more decentralized, how do you prevent people from saying, gee, this is great, as long as they don't notice, I'm going to go do what really interests me. And, I think it gets the project further along. I think it makes a more interesting newspaper. And the editor says, as I can attest to myself, no, that's not what we're here for. That's not what our, subscribers are paying for. How do you realign these incentives and ensure that unsupervised people are still pulling in the same direction?
That's a great question, or bundle of questions, Peter.
Yeah, sorry.
It's a good stream. In a notion of agile or an agility, we have another notion, which is also a contradiction, or a contradistinction, I should say, with the traditional command and control model. And that notion is transparency or visibility. And what that means is that work is never hidden. The reasons for doing the work are never hidden. The outputs of the work are never hidden. And the costs of the work are never hidden. All the actors have equal access to nearly all the information. There may be some things that are management level need to know type things, but it works better when information is equally distributed. And that works in a lot of different ways. It means that individuals within a team will know that the work that they do is visible. The speed with which they do that work is visible. And the value that work does to the whole, the contribution that they're making, is visible, is measured, is known, and is quantified. So individuals and teams make visible the work they're doing, the quality of the work they're doing, the risks associated with that work, and the benefit that work delivers to the organization. You can't have agile without transparency. You don't have agile.
Brooklyn has a question from the audience. We're going to go live to Christelle
right
now.
Oh, I'm here. Thanks, Peter. Hey, David, we have a question in the comments on Facebook, and I want to invite everybody to comment on Facebook and YouTube. So, David, could you list some powerful agile killers you have experienced in the projects you have worked? And do you see quick win remedies? How about for the long run, too? It's a long question. It's a few questions at the same time.
Well, agile killers. I think some really good ways to kill agile. I would say let's start with my favorite, which is the false face stakeholders. Stakeholders who say they support agile, but really don't. That is the best way to kill an agile project. If the stakeholders or the sponsors aren't committed transparently to supporting the project and accept the ebbs and flows, the ups and downs, the evolution of the work, it's not going to succeed. There's no chance that a brilliant team can overcome a disingenuous project sponsor. And so the first thing to make sure is that the project sponsor really embraces agile. There may be some doubts, but it has to be an open arms approach. That's the first thing. The second thing, and this is well thought about in agile, is that an agile team doesn't have room for heroes. It doesn't have room for big egos. It doesn't have room for superstars. Those attitudes are lethal to an agile, an open, agile, transparent work mode, because the contributions of every team member are legitimate and critical, and the meetings, which, as we know in Agile, are called ceremonies, cannot be dominated by a single personality. And that is, and so, in Agile, Scrum, and the various methodologies and the various schools of thought, there's a lot of talk about managing the team and managing the personalities. So that's the second big killer. A third big killer, and I'll list four, is hidden agendas or hidden work. We talked about the concept of transparency. It is critical that all the work the team is trying to do and is expected to accomplish is visible. If any member of the team or the team itself is keeping work hidden, that is going to degrade the quality of the Agile experience, because the individual and team commitments won't be 100%. It's impossible. We don't want people working 20 hours a day or 15 hours a day for long periods of time. It's not productive. And so if the work is important, if the work is of value to the team or the stakeholders, it should be visible. The fourth killer, I would say, and maybe I'll be a little controversial in saying this, is something I'm going to call the false expectation of speed. What do I mean by that? Managers, sponsors, and executives sometimes are sold on Agile because they're told that it's a way to go fast and get things done quickly. And while it's true that Agile teams are obsessed with delivering value and avoiding waste, speed is not an intrinsic Agile virtue, and it is not the case that Agile team members are thinking about how to work quickly. What they're thinking about is how to avoid working on the wrong stuff and to work instead on the right stuff, and to do the right stuff in the right order, and to do it with minimal waste and maximum efficiency. The end result of a high-performing Agile team should be that you get the right stuff done first and quickly, and that's what we want to do. But it can be a very negative effect on the team if the expectations are that all they have to do is go fast, as if they're resistant to that idea somehow. So those are four things, and there are others that as I said, false expectations of stakeholders, big egos, hidden work, and false expectations of speed can really derail an agile excellence, the excellence of an Agile team.
Thanks, David. And I see another question just popped up. What will happen to the projects or companies who will not work in Agile mode?
Well, this is a big question and a good one. I don't want to say that I have all the answers to that. I think that in our personal lives and in our professional lives, we are all seeing massive change all around us, and for us as individuals and us as workers and for us as participants in companies, we know that we have to have a mindset that allows us to accommodate change, and for organizations that can't do that, it's going to be a harder path. Networks are only as durable as their ability to accept and accommodate change, and we hope, I hope, that COVID-19 is the worst crisis that we experience in our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. I really hope that, but it's a hope. It's an article of faith. It's a belief. it's not a rational expectation that I have. And so I think the more logical explanation is, hey, we've had this really big change in the world. We saw this manifestation of, well, let's call it the butterfly effect, a small local disturbance in Wuhan, China, through the scalability of positive reinforcement of the global pandemic has unleashed a catastrophic effect.
All right, give you back the baton, Peter. Yeah. I'm gonna go away, remove myself. Thank you, David, and thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christelle. Well, David, you bring up a really interesting point here about durability. We had talked earlier about the concept of robustness versus resiliency, and we all tend to think that being robust is really important. It means you can withstand changes, withstand things that happen to you, but in fact, there's a lot more to that, and robustness does not actually equal resilience. And so when you talk about durability, it's important to start with the resiliency, I think. And I wonder if you could just walk us through that concept.
Yes, Peter. So, in the notion of network theory, you have two virtues that describe the strength of networks. And one of those virtues is indeed robustness. And, you hear this described a lot. You hear it on commercials for Verizon. They have a robust network, and what that means is that the network is strong. It's redundant. It has high throughput, high capacity. In effect, it has high resistance to change. So robustness means high resistance to change. Because I'm robust, I can withstand, I can be buffeted by these forces and not change. I can stay the same. I can deliver the same outputs despite these additional inputs. And that's important. We all want the cell phone system to work. You mentioned living up temporarily in Litchfield, Connecticut. We discovered that our phone wires here were installed in the early 1960s. And so running the internet over these now ancient wires has its own challenges. They are not robust, it turns out. Luckily, we are resilient, which is the second attribute of networks. Resiliency is not the ability to withstand change, to resist it, but to accommodate it, to accept it, to find workarounds, to find new pathways, to recombine, and to accept that change is inevitable and normal and can be accommodated. And we talked about this notion of the command and control model versus the agile model, and there's a notion here of the bigger they come, the harder they fall. There is it is very difficult for any robust network to withstand the kind of forces that a global pandemic can unleash on it. The U.S. Navy can't, the meat industry can't, the health industry can't, the transportation industry can't. Hopefully the telecommunications industry is in good shape, but it's difficult. And so resilience is the key for us as individual and social and commercial actors, being able to accommodate change and find new pathways.
So looking at specifics, I mean, you mentioned two. You mentioned that we're suddenly realizing really are quite vital and important to our life in the 21st century. One is the telecom industry, and particularly mobile telecoms, or in your case, very, very non-mobile stationary telecom. And the other, you mentioned the meatpacking industry, which is suddenly, no one's thought about this for years. It's grown up as something that, originally farmers, it must have been an extraordinarily resilient industry because every farmer slaughtered his own cattle and took it to a market. And so if one guy's farm was destroyed in a flood or a fire, there were 20, 30 other families with farms who could supply the market. That's changed. I think there are 4 major meatpacking companies now. They all do everything the same way. And then we hear that there are one packing house that handles 5% of the nation's pork, 900 cases of COVID shutting the entire thing down, and surprisingly for 5% of the pork, disrupting the entire market. With telecoms, we talk about 5G, we talk about 4G, we talk about landlines, we talk about IoT and all these different things. But again, there has to be some kind of resiliency built into robustness. Maybe you just walk us through in either of those two scenarios, whichever one you prefer. What would that change look like? Long question.
It's a very good question. We can only speculate here. What the disruption is going to entail. A lot of it has to do with how long it lasts. But the large, vertically integrated, command and control, traditional production lines are at great risk because they don't have the ability to easily accommodate this kind of change. From what I understand, and getting to the edge of my knowledge here, the meat industry in the United States has, shall we say, seemed to benefit from a lack of regulation. That may not turn out to be long-term such a great thing. If regulations were imposed on the industry to affect worker safety in an equalized manner, it might actually be better for all the actors. But that doesn't seem to be what's going to be happening. So if we have large networks like that at risk and they fail, then I think maybe we'll return to smaller networks, as you said, Peter. We've seen that already in our personal lives in the food industry. For those of us who can, we prefer to buy meat and other products from local farmers. Maybe the big agricultural institutions will have a harder time surviving these kinds of disruptions. Maybe a society that depends on these highly disruptible kinds of corporations and kinds of structures isn't resilient.
Mm. And we're coming close to the end of our time slot, but I wanted to ask you one last thing, which you just sort of touched on here in talking about buying your meat from local farmers. This whole COVID-19's really thrown a curveball at people personally. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning from homeschooling to, just reliving our lives, changing how we think and do things. How do we adopt this agility and resiliency into our own lives? Simply beyond the corporation, because I think it's got to be a mindset change the way we're talking about this, that goes beyond I arrive at the office at 9 o'clock and I become resilient, then I go home and resort to my old-fashioned ways. So how do we incorporate this in our own lives?
Another, I think, provocative question here to try to pick up at the end of the session, Peter. I'll bring back something I mentioned earlier, and it's the disposition of an agile team. It's the three questions, not the four, the three questions that the agile team has the inclination to ask itself. What are we doing? How are we doing it? And why are we doing it? And in an agile way, we want to answer those questions. We call it refining the work, refining the user stories, preparing the sprint backlog to, get really inside baseball. And we want to do that before we start the work, before we put that work in progress. That's the agile way in software development. But we can ask those three questions in our own lives as well. What am I doing? How am I doing it? And why am I doing it? And I think I mentioned homeschooling. I mentioned which all of us are confronting. I mentioned access to healthcare, which is a factor for all of us. Going to the grocery store. These are things that we need to rethink. These are things we need to rethink how we do. And how do I interact with my friends? How do I keep in touch with my family? How do I occupy my time? If we have the disposition to ask ourselves what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it, I believe we'll do it better and with more satisfaction.
Well, thank you very much, David. Christelle tells me she's got another question from a listener or watcher.
Yes.
Can we go over to Christelle for a second?
Yes, the last question is for me even. What about having different levels of agile maturity in an organization? We often see that the development teams are agile, but not the rest of the company. What do you think about this topic?
I think that's really true. Agile grew up in the software industry. It was adopted because it sounded really good by the management consulting industry, and that's for sure the case. That Agile and agility are going to not be evenly distributed within any organization. To maybe say one thing on this topic, I would say that one of the notions in Agile is humility, and for those of us and those of you who consider yourselves Agile practitioners, let's adopt a humble approach and help those around us and not be too proud.
Okay, well, David, thank you very, very much for joining us today on DefCon 19 and PentaLive. That was David Golub of PentaLive.